Hello, my name is Chandra Haynes, and I am providing some insight on this week's assignment, reflecting on the stages of disasters and how traumatic they can be in individuals' lives. So, first question is collective trauma is described as a blow to the basic tissues of social life that damage the bonds attaching people together and impairs the prevailing sense of community. How would I interpret that to someone who just went through a disaster? So, what I would say is that every aspect of a person's life essentially is affected and altered when you go through a disaster. That is so true, right? And there's a point where they have to try to decipher what occurred, why did it occur, and then there's a lot of other different emotions and feelings that set in. And so what I would try to explain to them is that it does damage the bond that you may have with an individual who maybe was a part of the disaster, caused the disaster, or even the bond with yourself in terms of trusting yourself, feeling guilty and shame. And so what I would look at this particular context in this text where it says, it's hard enough to face suffering that has been inflicted. And deep down, many traumatized people are haunted by the shame that they feel about themselves or just the circumstances. They despise themselves for how terrified, dependent, excited, or even enraged that disastrous event made them feel. And so essentially I would have to tell, if this was me in intervening or assessing a client, this is something that you would have to look at from multiple lenses, and it's not anything that you would be able to fathom or really understand overnight. And so what we could do essentially is just kind of take it apart piece by piece and just try to, assess each part based off feelings and emotions and events and thoughts and resolve and just the whole aspect of the event, so that we can try to help you get a better understanding as to why these things have occurred. And then finally, the prevailing sense of the community aspect of it, we would just need to look at how it, obviously affected the community, tore the community apart, and what can we do to try to help either rebuild or restart. So the second question, what kind of impact may the stress of going through a disaster have on a person's mental well-being? Well, first and foremost, there was a phrase I had here where it says, so the root of suffering is attachment. The reason that most people are suffering from a disaster is because of whatever attachment that they have with that disaster, right? There's an external notion of callings that may be helpful resources for those that are experiencing the effects of a traumatic event. So trauma often shatters our self-generated plans, so to speak, right? Whatever it is that we already had, in mind to do, or how we even want to go about this based off of this disastrous event that just occurred. And an external locus of calling may prove to be more durable. So what this author is saying is that everything happens for a reason. Nothing happens by happenstance. Of course, this is also biblical, right? Where God talks about in Ecclesiastes, everything happens for a reason, and there's a time for certain things to happen, a time to mourn, a time to be born, a time for death, and I think that when these things happen, one, they build our character typically. Two, they can bring us closer to God because we're trying to see and recognize and have an understanding of this particular disaster happened because it was already preordained by God. If it wasn't, why did it happen, right? And then 3, it helps us to have a sense of what we should be doing during a natural disaster. What should we be doing after a natural disaster, and excuse me, how we should carry ourselves in conjunction to whatever this natural disaster, caused, right? Because of course folks are dealing with, like in the Hurricane Katrina, folks lost their homes, churches, local stores, just their whole communities were shattered. And so trying to figure out coping mechanisms during this time is a lot. And so ideally the goal would be to just sit with an individual and help them strategize how they can deal with their emotions and their mental state of mind in a conducive manner that will help them not feel any guilt or shame on themselves, but really just to look, where do we go from here? You know what I mean? So the Bible states that in Romans 8:28, God works all things out for our good, and for those who love him and who are called accordingly. So when anything does happen in our lives, we do have to look at, why did it happen? And then look at the goodness of things as well, not just the bad that happened, right? God saved us. I'm still here, and so why did God save me? What are we looking at? Am I the goodness of God? Am I someone who's called? If we're called, there's a reason we're still here. God still has a plan for our life, Jeremiah 29:11. And so then we have to start to, look at things from a religious, more biblical standpoint so we can figure those things out, right? And then third question is, the recovery process has a number of stages. What are those stages? How and when is a counselor needed throughout a person's recovery stages? So the first stage is the pre-disaster stage, where awareness is setting in, people are shocked, there's a lot of uncertainty, and then the disaster hits. For survivors, not so much as the responders, but it can be something that's setting in over time in terms of your intensity level, because when the disaster hits, it's something that is an accumulation of feelings and emotions, and there's a growing sense that life will just never be like the same again, which is a lot to fathom and a lot to deal with, right? Because now you have to start all over, and you have to figure out what your new normal, such as the pandemic, right, that we just went through, COVID-19. What is our new normal going to be like? How do we get through this? Then there's the heroic phase, where you start to get some support, money, time, resources, and things start to come together in this stage. And then after that, we have the honeymoon phase, where there's a sense that I can breathe again. Everything is probably going to be all right, probably, right, in quotations, because you don't know what the end is going to be. So then this is where faith will come into play, and you would just have to trust that everything is going to be all right, right? And then there's the disillusionment phase. It's a true impact of what actually occurred is now noticed from your eyes. Like the blinders are taken off, the dust has settled, and now it's like, what is going on? And so mentally, this is where a lot of people can get lost and get despaired and get depressed, and just really recognize life is never going to be the way it was prior to the event, right? And then finally, in the recovery process, we have reconstruction phase. This is when we're starting our new normal, right? And we're doing things different. We're doing things hopefully better. There is obviously a few selected folks who just go down into a rabbit hole and just can't find their ways back up into the light of day. But ultimately, the goal is to, when you're going through suffering, it's to bring forth character, and it's to help you be stronger. So this author says the reason suffering often contributes to flourishing is that it provides a reorientation, a reevaluation of one's pursuit in life. Adverse events show us that we are fragile, that the future is uncertain, and that what happens to us can be random. Suffering is a gift, but not an intrinsic one. At minimum, it should serve to lead us back into relationship with and dependency on God. And that would be the mannerism of how I would try to counsel and support a client who has gone through a disaster, to have them look at the good, the bad, and the indifferent of the situation, peel it apart layer by layer, and really just try to dive into the meaning behind it all, what it did, how did it impact, and where do we go from here, and ultimately, what did God want us to learn from it, and how will we grow from it, right? So as far as instituting a counselor throughout this process, it would be right away, right from the beginning. A counselor would be flexible, to be right on the spot, right in the midst of the disaster, to help guide the survivor through all the processes and phases that they're about to be up against. So thank you so much for listening. I've included the following references in my responses. Koch Bessel, 2014, The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. HBU's Stages of Disaster video, 2019. And Gingrich 2017, Treating Trauma in Christian Counseling. Thank you so very much. God bless.